Hello. I'm William and I'll be your instructor today. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to draft legal text for your organization. This tutorial is aimed primarily at lawyers, although some of the topics that we'll cover today can get quite technical. I'll try to avoid diving in too deep, instead providing you with an introductory overview to equip you with just enough knowledge to get started and draft your own agreements. For more details, I've provided links in the description to documentation where you can dive deeper into the topics. Naturally, we're ready to support you, so don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or need help. The topics that I will cover today include an introduction to contracts and how Mercenta implements the mechanism of an offer and acceptance by the companies that are party to an agreement. I'll show you how legal text fits into agreements, proposals and proposal approval workflows. Then I'll focus on each of the 4 elements of legal text, including agreement data, the templating language, document formatting and styling, before finally bringing all these elements together in the form of a legal text template. In order to demonstrate Mercenta's software, I may touch on various legal topics. I am not a lawyer, and nothing in this tutorial constitutes legal advice, and is not intended to be a substitute for legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should seek legal advice or other professional advice in relation to any particular matters you or your organization may have. I have attached Mercenta's disclaimer in the description. Before we get started, your organization administrator should have registered your organization on Mercenta. If you wish to follow along, then you'll also need the Legal Text Manager, Proposal Manager, and Proposal Lawyer permission sets so that you can access the resources needed for this tutorial. You should also be familiar with Mercenta's user interface. It's quite intuitive, but if you need any help, we have also uploaded a tutorial titled How to Use the Mercenta Portal on this channel. I'll also expect you to know some legal terms, and you should be familiar with basic contract law so that you can understand some of the concepts I'll refer to. As I mentioned before, some of the topics are quite technical, but I think if you are familiar writing formulae in Excel, then you should be able to keep up. If you have VBA coding skills in Excel, then that would be a real plus. But don't worry, if you don't, then a good strategy would be to do the legal wordsmithing yourself and get help from an IT professional or Mercenta support for the tricky bits. Before we get into legal text, let's first introduce agreements, proposals and approval workflows, because you'll need to understand how legal text fits into these 3 important elements. An agreement is a contract between the buying and supplying companies that are party to an agreement. The act of forming or amending an agreement requires an offer and acceptance by all the parties. The mechanism by which an offer is made and accepted is accomplished in Mercenta through a proposal and a proposal approval workflow. A proposal encapsulates the changes that a party wishes to make to an agreement. Once the authors of the proposal are satisfied, they submit it for approval. Mercenta will first ensure that the proposing parties each approve before sending it to the approving parties for their review. The parties each individually review and approve or reject the proposal using their own predefined approval workflow. Each company is responsible for designing and then assigning their approval workflow to a proposal. Within an approval workflow, there is a predefined sequence of steps that have to happen in order for the approval to progress to a conclusion. Either the party approves or rejects the proposal. Some steps require review by a nominated job, department, position or user, although ultimately these entities are resolved down to specific users. More often than not, these decision makers will be legal counsel and other affected stakeholders, including executives and managers. When the decision makers are requested to review the proposal, they are able to view the terms and conditions of the original agreement and the terms and conditions of the new proposal. They will also be able to view the highlighted or marked up differences between the original agreement and the new proposal, and also a list of changes encompassed in the proposal. If any of the parties reject the proposal, then it is rejected in its entirety. The authors may either abandon the proposal or make changes and resubmit it for approval. On the other hand, if the proposal is accepted by all the parties, then the proposal is merged into the agreement and it becomes binding on the parties. We may also say in legal jargon that the contract is amended. In Mercenta, we define the terms and conditions of the contractual relationship between parties in legal text. Legal text is composed of three elements: templating, formatting, and styling. We will discuss each of these in detail in the remaining sections of this tutorial. When combined with an agreement's data, it produces a document which outlines the terms and conditions of the agreement. Because legal text is templated, it is dynamic, in that it automatically adjusts when changes are made to agreements. Multiple legal text templates may be developed for your organization covering different legal requirements and reused in different agreements. Or you can develop custom legal text for a particular proposal, which is only used in that agreement. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to draft legal text for your organization, but the same knowledge can be used for drafting legal text for a particular proposal. You can also draft legal text in the form of snippets. These are reusable bits of text or template code. One strategy that we've seen implemented is to use snippets as a source of boilerplate or optional clauses covering terms like JIT delivery, forecasting, warranty, choice of law, indemnification, confidentiality, etc. These optional clauses can be dropped into an agreement's legal text depending on its requirements. You could even go as far as foregoing legal text templates completely. Instead, building your contracts on an ad hoc basis by dropping in boilerplate as needed. In practice, however, the happy medium is somewhere in between. Before we get into the detail of designing templates, let's head over to the portal where I'll show you around the area where you'll be managing legal text. I've navigated to the portal, located at mars.mercenta.com, which has been set up by our organization administrator, signed in, and landed on the home page. You'll notice that we are currently running 0.7 of the software and that this is a preview or beta release. We'll try to keep these tutorials up to date, especially if there are any significant changes. But you may notice some small cosmetic variations in your version. Legal text is defined at the organization level. So let's load our organization menu by clicking Organization from the main menu. And then click Legal Text under the Modules section. You'll notice that this menu is divided into three sections. First, a section for templates which contains complete legal text which you can use in your agreements. Second, a section for snippets which contain bits of legal text, functions, or template which you can reuse in your legal text. Most organizations will put reusable preambles or recitals, clauses, articles, and sections here. And finally, a section for representative agreement data that you can use for debugging your templates and snippets in the absence of real data. You'll notice that we pre-populate each of these three sections with templates, snippets, and data. These items are provided to you by Mercenta for demonstration purposes or as a starting point for your own templates on an as-is basis without warranty of any kind, either express or implied. You should seek legal advice before using these items in your organization. With that said, I'll create some new representative data now by clicking the plus icon in the data section. And then input a unique name and description. Then click Save to create a new record. The data that has been pre-populated here might look a little odd, but I'll explain what it means in a second. When legal text is deployed in an agreement, it uses the real live data from that agreement. But for development purposes, you'll need representative data for debugging. You can maintain multiple versions of representative data, with each version representing a different agreement scenario. Then you can change this data when you're debugging your templates. We've chosen to represent the agreement data in a human-readable textual format called JavaScript Object Notation, which is shortened to JSON. This might sound complicated, but in fact, it's easy to understand, and you should be able to master it relatively quickly. Since JSON is an open standard, there is also plenty of online resources available if you need more help or want to dive into more detail about the standard. The structure of JSON is very simple. It consists only of objects, which are represented by curly braces, containing a list of properties, which are represented as name-value pairs. These name-value pairs are separated by a colon. Multiple properties in an object are separated by commas. The name of the property is always written in quotation marks. For example, if you're representing a user, then possible names could include the user's first name, surname, or age. The value of the property could be any of the following data types: text, numbers, boolean, date, an object, an array, or undefined, which we call null. Text and date values should always be wrapped in inverted commas. All of the difficulty in JSON is understanding these data types, so I'll spend a minute or two explaining them in more detail. Text, number, and boolean types are the most simple. Text includes any string surrounded by quotation marks. Note that empty text is represented as nothing between the quotation marks. Don't use quotation marks on any other data types except date, otherwise they will be interpreted as text. A number could be an integer or decimal and may be positive or negative. Boolean values can only be either true or false. Dates need special attention because they must be formatted exactly matching the ISO date standard. You must provide the year, month and day, but the time values are optional. Note, the Z on the end means UTC, or Universal Time. Objects are simply JSON objects which themselves have other properties. The most complex data type is the array. Arrays are enclosed within square brackets and contain lists of items separated by commas. In this example, the array contains first names of people, but arrays could also contain numbers, dates, booleans, objects, and even other arrays. Finally, there is another value that could exist. It's called the null. It really means that this value is undefined or has not been set. If a default value is not required, then using null indicates that it has not been defined. However, if the field is required, then using null is not permitted. Let's look at a more complete example, which is listed on the right-hand side. First, notice that the JSON document always starts with a curly brace, indicating that this is an object. This object contains an agreement name as text, 2 effective dates, a Boolean property indicating whether the proposal is new, a price round number, and finally an array of objects, called items, each with a name and description property. Note that the effective to value is null, indicating that it is undefined. Before we continue at the portal, just one word of warning. One disadvantage of using JSON is that you will need to be precise with the text. Here are a few areas to watch out for. Firstly, the property names cannot be changed since they must align exactly with the agreement data. Also note that property names need to be wrapped in inverted commas. Small errors like a misplaced or missing colons, commas, or brackets will cause errors. Also be aware that you must match the data type exactly. You can't put inverted commas around numbers, Boolean, or other non-text values since Mercenta will interpret it as text. Dates should be wrapped in inverted commas. Finally, using null for required values will cause errors also. Let's head back to the portal where we will continue editing our data. In this beta release, we've provided a relatively bare-bones JSON editor. Features such as line numbering, syntax, and error highlighting are planned for future releases. In the meantime, you're free to use alternatives which you can download or use online. I'll provide links in the description for some of the better-known options. If you decide to go this route, then simply copy and paste your data between editors. When new representative data is created, we automatically populate it with empty agreement data. We've provided a specification of the data types used in the documentation, but in most cases, you can easily guess these by now from the property names and default values. Let's go ahead now and update the agreement name. And fill in details for the first proposal for the agreement. As you may recall, even the act of creating an agreement in Mercenta requires a proposal. Later, we'll use the merge or execution date of the last amendment as the agreement's effective date. Next, I'll provide the start and expiry dates of the agreement. Then I'll input some buying and selling parties to the agreement. First, I'll remove the products since I'm not going to use them in this tutorial. and then I'll fill in the details for the two buying parties. I'm using addresses that are a little closer to home this time. And then details for the two supplying parties. If you're not comfortable editing like this, there are simpler ways of creating representative data. You could copy and paste the data directly from a real or dummy proposal. If you do this, you might want to anonymize the copied data so that it does not contain sensitive information. Now that I've finished, I'll save our changes. If there are any parsing errors, these will be displayed in the validation area at the bottom. Now that our changes are saved, I'll show you how to delete data. Let's delete our default data since we don't need it anymore. Click on the default data. Then, when the form loads, scroll to the bottom and click on the Remove button and confirm your changes. The data should be removed now. Since this data is just used for debugging purposes, there are no side effects of removing it. Now that you are familiar with representative data, and before we get into creating and editing templates, I'll brief you on the templating language that we use. A templating language contains the instructions on how to create a document by combining data with logic. This logic may include placeholders, conditions, loops, and functions which are used by the templating engine to construct the document. This might sound complicated, but if you know how to use Excel formulae, then it should be easy for you to master quickly. The best way to explain what it does is to show you a simple example. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see the three items which illustrate how the template works. The first is the JSON data, which is the source for the template. You should now recognize that this is a JSON object with a single property called agreement name with the value, my supply agreement. The template uses this data in a placeholder with some static text. And finally, the resulting document, which combines the template with the data. When the data changes, then the resulting document also changes. The template is composed of static text, which is fixed and never changes, and logic, which is always contained within double curly braces. The logic is evaluated each time the document is refreshed. In this tutorial, I'll cover placeholders, which you've already seen in action, loops, conditions, and functions. Links to a full description of the language can be found in the description. You've already seen placeholders in action in the previous slide, but I've added another level of complexity. To refer to a property in the data, use the exact same name used in the data. Note that placeholders are case sensitive. When referring to a nested object, such as in the example on the right, you should use the parent reports to, followed by a dot, and then the child property name. Placeholder values are usually output exactly as they are represented in the data. Data types like numbers, dates, Boolean values are printed exactly as they are represented in the data. This might cause problems, so you may need to format them. I'll show you how to do this using formatting functions later in the tutorial. Loops are a little more complicated. They are needed when you want to loop over an array to create lists or tables of data in your documents. There are two types of loops, for loops and while loops. The most commonly used is the for loop, which we will focus on here. The while loop is a little more complicated and is not used very often, so I'll refer you to the documentation for more details. There are three elements in a for loop. Firstly, the initializer, containing the property to loop and the name of the looping variable. The property that you use must be an array. Second, the body, where you can use the looping variable to output your content. And finally, the end statement, which closes out the for loop. To see how it all works, take a look at the example on the right. First, in the data, you'll notice that the items property contains an array of objects. Each object has a name property. In the template, I've set up a for loop to loop over the array of items. You'll also notice that I've declared the item variable which I use to reference the name property in the body. You'll also notice in the body that I've referenced another variable which is provided to us by the for loop, the for.index variable. This variable outputs the current count of the loop. In this case, it's outputting 0 and 1. There is a list of more special variables in the documentation. When the document is created, you'll notice that although it's printed the items correctly, there is a carriage return after each of the items. To show you what I mean, I've displayed the carriage returns in the template and the document, which you normally won't see, but are nevertheless there. When the template runs, the body is repeated for each of the items. This includes the carriage return that I've highlighted in red color. In most cases, this is not wanted and will result in an empty line for each of the items in the document. You can instruct the templating engine to ignore this carriage return and any spaces by placing a hyphen inside the double braces. This is called whitespace control in the documentation and is used everywhere where you are having problems with carriage returns and spaces being unintentionally rendered, not only in loops. Next, we'll cover conditions or control flow. This is useful when you want to decide to render something depending on whether a condition is true or false. There are two types of conditional statements, if-else and case-when. I'll only examine if-else statements because they are more commonly used. I'll refer you to the documentation if you want to learn about case-when statements. There are many ways of using if-else statements, but the simplest is shown here. First, there is an initial if statement with an expression which evaluates to true or false. There are various operators you can use including equals, not equals, greater than or less than. If the result is true, then the body is rendered, otherwise the next else if is evaluated if it has been specified. You can have an unlimited number of else if statements, but usually you will switch to the case-when method when there are more than 2 or 3 of them. An optional final else can be used to catch any that don't match the previous if or else if statements. Finally, you must close the conditional with an end statement. I've written a silly example on the right, which renders some text depending on the age. Since neither the if nor the if-else match, the else body is rendered. Note that there may also be invisible carriage returns here, so you may also wish to implement whitespace control, as I discussed on the previous slide. For the final topic on templating, I'll cover functions. In this slide, I'll show you how to use functions, and in the second slide, I'll show you how to write your own functions. Our templating language comes with a huge collection of built-in functions covering areas such as string, date, math, array operations, and more. Our built-in functions are named according to the following nomenclature. First the area, then a dot, followed by the function name. Hyphens are used if the name contains more than one word. Built-in function names are always lowercase. I've provided the link to the documentation for the built-in functions in the description of this tutorial. There are two ways of using functions. First, there is the standard way, which is simply to provide the function name, followed by a list of arguments separated by spaces. The second method, called piping, involves putting the first argument first, then the pipe symbol, which is a vertical line, followed by the function name, then any remaining arguments separated by spaces. The second method is the most useful, but you're probably asking yourself why, right? Well, piping is incredibly useful if you're chaining together multiple functions where the result of one would be the input into the next function. I'll show you how it's done in the example. In the example on the right, you'll see piping being used to print Bob's full name. First, I take the first name of the user, then I capitalize the name, then I append a space, then I append his surname, Smith, to produce the output, Bob Smith. The second function in the example uses the standard method of using functions. I take Bob's age and add 10 years using the math.plus function. In this second topic on functions, I'll show you how to write your own. Functions must be placed before they are used in a template. For this reason, it's a good idea to place them at the top, otherwise it might be confusing when they are scattered throughout your template. There are many ways to define functions, and I'll refer you to the documentation to understand them all, but to keep things simple, you'll only need to know two methods, and I'll divide them into two types based on the output that they produce. If your function returns a number, date, or Boolean value, then use the first method. If on the other hand, your function returns text, then use the second method. For both methods, we start the function with the font keyword, followed by the name of the function and optional arguments in brackets. The function name needs to be unique, and it's traditional to use all lowercase for the function name. I don't recommend that you do this since it's more error-prone, but you don't actually need to specify the arguments. If you don't want to specify arguments, then you can just refer to them in the dollar notation so that $1 and $2 refers to the first and second argument respectively, and so on. Let's look at the two methods in detail. The first method is more compact since it requires only a single set of curly braces, but you must indicate the value to return using the ret keyword. I've also highlighted the position of mandatory carriage returns, otherwise it won't work. It's possible to put everything on one line using semicolons, but I don't want to confuse things further. The second method looks more conventional in that we have a body section in which you can mix static text and logic. In this method, everything in the body is returned, which makes it very convenient for returning text. The example on the right shows the two methods in action. First, you'll notice that both of these two functions are placed at the top of the template. The first function uses the first method since it returns a single value, which is a number. The function subtracts two numbers. Another benefit of specifying arguments explicitly is that you can make some of the arguments optional. You'll notice the y parameter is optional since we've set it to 1 if not overridden by the caller. In fact, if you look at how we call this function, we haven't specified the y parameter, so it defaults to 1. 10-1 is correctly printed as 9. The second function in the example uses the second method since we're returning text. Here we're combining the user's name, Bob, with his age, which is provided as an argument. By now, you should also recognize that I'm using the piped method to call this function. Let's head back to the portal where I'll create a preamble or recital snippet which we can reuse in our agreements. I'm at the legal text menu where we left off last time. Create a new snippet by clicking the plus icon in the snippet section. When the form loads, key in a unique name and a description. And then click the Save button to create the snippet. Once our snippet is created, I'll scroll down to the editor area and maximize the form so that it's easier to see. Before we start writing template code, I'll select the representative data which we created earlier. Click the Data tab and then select Generic from the list of options. You'll note that our generic data which we created earlier has loaded. You'll notice too that it's editable, so you can adjust your values here to test different scenarios. Now that our data is selected, let's create the preamble. Click on the Template tab to get back to the template. In this beta release, we've provided a relatively bare-bones editor. Features such as line numbering, syntax, and error highlighting are planned for future releases. For the agreement title, I'll reference the agreement's name, which I'll capitalize using the string.uppercase function. You should be able to recognize that we're using the piped function notation here. As I mentioned earlier, I'll use the merge date of the last proposal as the effective date. This bit of template is a bit more complicated since it contains 4 steps and 3 functions. First, we take the array of merged proposals from the data. Second, I extract the merge date field from those merged proposals using the array.map function. The output from this is another array of dates. Third, I take the last date using the array.last function. Finally, I format the last date into a string using date.toString function. This takes a format argument which is day, month, and year. All these functions are listed in the documentation. Don't worry if you're feeling a little overwhelmed. You'll soon get the hang of it once you start. Next, I'll list the buying parties using a for loop, which we've already discussed. On the first row, we set up the loop. We're going to loop through each of the buying parties, setting it to the party parameter which we can use in the body. Then, in the body, we'll use this party parameter to reference each party's legal name, their short name as a definition, and their legal address. Finally, we'll close off the loop with an end statement. I'll repeat the same for the supplying parties. I'm assuming in this tutorial that you'll always have multiple parties, which may not be the case. If you want to have a more general-purpose snippet for the preamble, you could count the number of parties, and if there is only one, you could use a more condensed format. Now that the template is drafted, let's see how it looks. Click the View tab to render the results. Looks good. Except that it's printed in plain text with no formatting. We'll talk about formatting in the next section of the tutorial. Now that the snippet is finished, I'll save my changes by clicking the Save button. You can also see that the template has used the representative data to produce the output. Let's see what happens when we change the data. I'll click the Data tab, and then change the merge date from 2022 to 2023. Then go back to the View tab. Notice the effective date has changed from 2022 to 2023. As you've already noticed, the template so far has rendered the document in plain text only. This is because we haven't specified any formatting. While legal documents are often pretty dry, even the most Spartan lawyer appreciates some formatting. For this reason, we provide two methods to format your document: Markdown and HTML. Both languages are based on open standards and are widely used. This means that there is plenty of online documentation and editors. The best way of showing you the difference between the two is to give you an example of how they look. I've provided an example on the right which shows Markdown and HTML both outputting the same document. As you can see, both are relatively simple, but Markdown is considerably less verbose and it takes much less time to learn the syntax. In my experience, Markdown should be adequate for most of your needs. Our template parser supports both languages simultaneously, so you can use Markdown for most of your formatting and then insert HTML when you need finer control or more complex formatting. In this tutorial, I'll focus on Markdown and I'll only cover some of the basics you'll need to draft agreements. I'll refer you to the links to the documentation in the description for more complex syntax. First, we'll start with the text syntax. The easiest way to learn the syntax is by looking at examples. Firstly, text should just be typed normally. Text will automatically lap to new lines. Multiple carriage returns, as you can see highlighted in red in the example, are ignored. If you want more spacing, then you'll have to use styling, which we'll discuss later in this tutorial, or use the HTML break tag. Bold words or sentences should start and end with double asterisk symbols without spaces. Italics use an underscore in the same way. You can combine the effect by using underscore and double asterisk to get bold italic. Headings are probably the most used syntax in legal documents. You indicate a heading by using a hash symbol, where the number of hashes indicates the heading level, up to a maximum of 6 hashes. Spaces after the hash are ignored, and the heading terminates when a carriage return is reached, otherwise the heading wraps onto the next line. You can't make a heading bolder, but you can italicize all or part of a heading. There are two types of lists: unordered and ordered lists. The former is not commonly used in contracts, so I'll just focus here on ordered or numbered lists. You indicate an ordered list by using a number, followed by a dot, then at least one space. The list item ends when you enter a carriage return. Note that any numbers can be used, since the Markdown processor will automatically start with 1 and then continue incrementing until the last item. You must indicate that the list has ended by typing an additional carriage return, which I've highlighted in red in the example. You can also make the entire list item, or individual words, bold or italic as I've shown in the example. Unfortunately, Markdown does not support alphabetic numerals out of the box, which are commonly used in legal documents. There is a workaround using styling, which I won't cover now, but let me know if you need help getting it working. I also won't cover sublists, which are lists inside lists. These are supported by Markdown, but they are not commonly used in legal text because it makes contracts unnecessarily complicated. I'll refer you to the documentation if you want to use sublists in your templates. Tables are another commonly used item in legal text, especially in schedules or appendices. I usually prefer to use HTML for tables because it's easier to control column sizes, but you can get reasonably good results in Markdown too. Tables in Markdown require two components, the header and the rows. The header consists of two rows. One for the header names and another, a separator between the header and the rows. This separator is also able to indicate the column alignment. There is no need to line up the columns. The total table width and individual column widths cannot be adjusted, they just fill up the available space. Also, Markdown is quite forgiving when you mismatch the number of columns in the header and rows. In the example on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll notice that we're aligning the first and second columns to the left and the last column to the right. Continuing on from tables, I'll need to show you how to combine formatting and templating when loops are involved. Using loops to repeat content for each item of data is an important skill to master because there are many instances where you will need to create tables and lists from arrays of data. In the example on the right of the slide, we have data containing an array of items. The template shows you how to repeat the rows of the table by simply outputting the Markdown in the correct table row format. You'll notice that I've replaced the rows section with a for loop which loops through the list of items in the data, outputting one table row for each of the items. The same principle applies to lists and other repeating elements. Let's continue where we left off at the portal and add some formatting to our preamble snippet. First, I'll make the buying parties a level 5 header by using the Markdown hashes we mentioned earlier. Then, I'll turn the parties into a numbered list. First, I'll remove the white space from the body. Generally, you always want to do this for loops. Then, I'll denote the body as a list by adding a number followed by a dot and space. You may remember that the numbers don't need to be sequential. The Markdown parser will automatically number these for us. If you want to be pedantic, then you could use the for.index function here. I'll quickly repeat the same for the suppliers. Now that we're done, let's see how it looks. Click the View tab. Once the document is rendered, you'll notice that the text is now formatted. It still looks a little old-fashioned, but that's because it's using the default HTML styling. We'll talk about styling next. Now that we're finished, I'll click the Save button to save my changes. Then I'll minimize and close the form. Regardless of whether you use Markdown or HTML, or leave the document unformatted, it is ultimately rendered into HTML for display. By display I mean how the document is presented to you on our portal as a PDF or as a printed page. HTML is styled using a language called Cascading Style Sheets, or CSS for short. We'll talk briefly about CSS on the next slide. If you don't specify a style as we did in the previous demos, you will get the default style which, while readable, looks a little old-fashioned. CSS is a rules-based language. You define the rules by specifying groups of styles that should be applied to particular elements or groups of elements on your document. There are hundreds of different properties that CSS can define, including font, color, size, and spacing, and layout of your content. CSS works on an override principle. If you don't override a certain property, then the default is used. The best way to explain how it works is to give you an example, which I've displayed on the right side of the slide. First, you can see the resulting HTML which was generated by a template. We will attempt to style this HTML using CSS. In the CSS, you can see that I've set the text alignment for the H1 tag, which is the header 1, which I've highlighted in red. And I've also set the color property of the P tag, which is a paragraph, which I've highlighted in green. When the HTML is displayed, you'll note that these elements have been styled, leaving the default values untouched. Since styling is something that you normally do only once, I don't recommend that you spend a lot of time learning CSS. Instead, I recommend that you use the pre-populated example that I've provided on the portal and then tweak it to suit your preferences or house styling. But if you want to dig deeper, then I'll refer you to the plethora of online tutorials and documentation. Let's head back to the portal. By now, we've got all the building blocks necessary to pull together a complete legal text template. We'll do that now. The first thing we're going to do is to create a new legal text template. Since we're already on the legal text menu, click the plus icon in the template section and key in a unique name and description. Then click the Save button to create the template. Once the template has been created, I'll scroll down to the editor area and maximize the form so that it's easier to see. Before we start drafting the legal text, I'll select the data which we created earlier. Click the Data tab and then select Generic from the list of options. Once the data has loaded, click on the Template tab to get back to the empty editor. To start our agreement, I'll insert the preamble snippet that we created earlier. Click on the Snippets drop-down and select Preamble from the list. Then click the Insert Snippet button. This inserts the snippet at our current cursor position in the editor. At the moment it's empty, so the snippet will be added to the top of the editor. Once snippets have been added, they lose their link with the original, so they can be changed independently of each other. I've just noticed that I forgot to capitalize the now therefore phrase. I'll fix that now. I'll also have to fix that mistake in the original too. Next, I'll add a term clause to the agreement. For the start date, I'll reference the effective date that we defined in the preamble. But for the expiry date, I'll have to use a conditional since this value could be undefined. The if statement goes as follows. If the expiry date is null, then assume the contract is evergreen. This is a bit of a no-no in supply agreements, but anyway. Else, use the expiry date. You'll notice again that I'm using a piped function to format the date into a string using the date.toString function. This takes a day, month, and year formatting argument. Now that the template is drafted, let's see how it looks. Click the View tab to render the results. Looks good. Except that it needs styling. We'll do that next. To style the template, click on the Style tab. As I mentioned earlier, CSS is not something that you need to become an expert in, since it's generally only done once and then shared across your organization. I recommend that you copy our predefined style and tweak it to suit your requirements. Or ask someone in your IT department or at Mercenta support for help. But for this tutorial, I'll write a simple style for the current elements in our template. First, I'm going to define the global font and font size for the entire document. Then I'll set the font size for the two headings that I've used in the template. And finally, I'll style the list so that each item is nicely spaced. Now that I'm done, let's go back and see how the document looks. Click the View tab to render the document. Looks even better. Now that I'm done, I'll click the Save button to save my changes. Now that we've finally completed drafting our legal text template, I'll show you how you can use it in your agreements. But first, some theory. Proposals may either be created to create a new agreement or created from an existing agreement. If it's a new agreement, then the user will have the option of selecting a template from the list of legal text templates defined by the organization. If the agreement already exists, then the agreement's legal text along with all its data will be copied to the proposal for editing. While a proposal is open, an authorized user will have the ability to edit the legal text template and style, inserting snippets, or even replacing the entire template with a fresh copy from the organization. When you insert a snippet or replace the legal text template, it loses its connection with the original, so they can be changed independently of each other. Finally, when a proposal is submitted for review and approved, its legal text is obviously merged into the agreement since it's an integral part of the agreement. If any of the parties subsequently wish to change the agreement by creating a new proposal, the agreement's legal text is copied to the proposal, along with the rest of the data, so that it can be modified by the proposing party. Let's head back to the portal so I can show you how legal text is used when creating a new agreement. Starting back at the home page, click on the Agreement main menu. Then click the sublink to view the agreements as a buyer. Only the buying parties can initiate supply agreements in Mercenta. When the agreement menu loads, click the Create Agreement link to create a new proposal. You may recall from the introduction, even the act of creating an agreement requires a proposal in Mercenta. When the form loads, I'll choose Acme as the supplying organization. Then input a name for the proposal. And then find the generic template, which we created earlier, from the list of templates on the organization. Then click the Save button to create the proposal. Once the proposal is created, click the Legal Text menu in the Agreement section. The first thing you'll notice is that the template that we created earlier has been copied to the proposal. Let's take a look around before we view the template. First, let's click the Data tab to view the current data for the proposal. You'll notice that the data from the proposal is automatically shown in JSON format. This data is automatically updated when the contributors update the proposal. We can also edit the JSON here to test different scenarios, but we'll lose our changes when we close this form. Next, we'll look at the styles by clicking the Style tab. You'll notice that the original style has also been copied to the proposal. There is no connection with the original, so we can make changes here to adjust the style only for this proposal. Let's go back to the template by clicking the Template tab. Like styles, we can edit this template and also insert snippets from the snippet list. We can also completely replace this template using one from the organization. But I won't make any changes since the user interface should be very familiar to you now. Let's render the proposal as it looks currently by clicking the View tab. You'll notice that most of the fields are empty. That's because we haven't yet started authoring the proposal yet. Once the contributors start making changes, we will see those changes automatically reflected here. This final demonstration concludes this tutorial. Thank you for your attention and congratulations for staying until the end. In this tutorial, I showed you how Mercenta implements the contractual mechanism of offer and acceptance and explained how legal text fits into agreements, proposal and proposal approval workflows. Then I introduced snippets which you can use for your boilerplate. For most of the time I got down to the nitty-gritty of drafting legal text. I went through each of the 3 building blocks of a template, templating, formatting and styling, and showed you how, when combined with agreement data, a document is produced. Finally, I closed the loop by demonstrating how legal text templates can be actually used in your agreements and proposals. We've certainly covered a lot of material, but by now you should be able to start authoring legal text templates on your own. Invariably you'll need to learn more, so in the description I've provided links to more reading material, specifications and tools. Don't hesitate to reach out to us at support@mercenta.com if anything is still unclear or you need any help. Goodbye.